Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I'm going to be discussing the case of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. It's an 1855 case. I first came across it during, um, around the time I was in law school, and I started to get interested in critical race theory. Cases. By the way, critical race theory, I know it's a buzzword in America. Uh, However, it's not something they teach in high school or even generally in university. Critical race theory is something that lawyers came up with. So, because law impacts everybody in the society, but in different ways. And so, it's in law school. Many people who are interested in an aspect of constitutional law, race relations law, they're the ones who coined that phrase, critical race theory. And so, if I were to define critical race theory, it's just a study of how the law impacts people differently based on their race, their ethnicity, and or even their proximity to a race. So, if we go back to the Constitution, we're a nation of laws. We've evolved from English common law, and we have our Constitution, which is the ultimate law of the land. The preamble of our Constitution and everything in the Constitution, right? If it's in the Constitution, it means it's constitutional, right? It's a guide for us. It's guidance. So things normally have to be consistent with what's in our Constitution, their protections or the objectives of our Constitution. And so the preamble of our Constitution gives us the objective, right? Remember, our Constitution starts, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, right? So that's the beginning. So you see, establishing justice is a central, um, it's a central objective of the United States Constitution. We're trying to form a more perfect union, and our founding fathers believed by establishing justice, we would have a more perfect union. Our founding fathers understood that the nature of people and societies, they're dynamic, especially considering the circumstances of how America came to be. So they're dynamic. So our union wasn't yet perfect. We're a work in progress. We keep working towards it. Um, if we establish justice, then things would, we're headed in the right direction, right? So, the case of Celia, um, of course, then chattel slavery was still constitutional and protected, especially in the South, right? This was 1855, so just a few years, 5, 6 years from the Civil War, right? From the secession of the Southern states, and it's also importantly 2 years before the dreadful Dred Scott decision. So it's interesting that these two cases regarding regarding rights of Black Americans. And I'm going to get into the case of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. I'm going to get into it, but these two cases, arise from Missouri, right? The state of Missouri. So Missouri was very instrumental during the era of slavery, right? Antebellum America. So you see, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So Missouri was a very significant state, right, regarding this contentious issue of slavery. The Dred Scott decision, which in 1857, in which Chief Justice Roger Taney of Maryland, the state of Maryland, that's again, I always have to put it out there. The state of Maryland is one that has filed a malicious prosecution against me based on race. So you're seeing a xenophobic racist and a corrupt, um, malicious prosecution against me in the state of Maryland. So Maryland is known for corruption, right? They're very known for racism and corruption, public corruption. So, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled in 1857. At that time, James Buchanan was our 15th president. He was the incumbent. And Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that he wrote the opinion, and the court ruled that African Americans were not slaves. Sorry, African Americans were slaves, and they were not American citizens. They couldn't be American citizens. They didn't have a right to petition in court. These were his conclusions, which were very wrong, and of course were overruled subsequently. And so we're seeing the injustices that happened in the case of, we'll see the injustices that happened in the case of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. So we see that slave women, black slave women, could not expect to have the same rights, and the law didn't view black people in the same way as it viewed whites during the era of slavery, during the era of chattel slavery. So the story of Celia is, and this is what I'm doing all of this in honor of Black History Month. So if you're a Nigerian audience, so you can appreciate the struggles, the dehumanization that Black Americans, their ancestors, have had to go through, have had to overcome in the courts, the humiliation, the abuses in society, and the trauma, because um, the stories are passed down, from household, from a Black American's household, from generation to generation, and it's informed how they respond to the broader society, right? The broader society, how they, you know, how they conduct themselves, and how they perceive injuries against the Black community, because it's you know so through these stories, at least we can get an idea through some of these cases. And so this is again a significant case. There are many books regarding Celia you can get. They're available online, which you can actually have a free copy, a PDF copy. And I've read the story, so I'm just going to quickly give a summary of what happened. So Celia was born in around 1836. It's a story about a Black slave woman who killed her master, right? And she killed her master, and then she goes to trial because of murder for killing her master. Now, so let me get back to the origin story of Celia herself. So she was born in around 1836 in Missouri, and so when she was about 14 years old, a guy called Robert Newsom. Newsom was a farmer in Callaway County. He came into Audrin County and purchased Celia, right? He purchased Celia, and then he transported her to Callaway County. She was 14 years old at the time. On the way during the trip, he raped her. It was the first time he would rape her, and he would subsequently rape her numerous times, over the course of 5 years. So she was 14 at the time. By the time she was 19, and she would she would bear two children as a result of the rape by Mr. Newsom, right? I wonder if he's related to Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, because it's an unusual name. I don't know. I'll check it up. I'll look it up and see if it's if it's information we can actually access. So Newsom, by the way, was a 70-year-old man at the time he purchased Celia, and once Celia arrived, in on his property, his premises, right, it became obvious that the reason why he purchased her was to make her his concubine, right, to be having these to be extorting sex from her. So she was 14, she became pregnant, she had brought two children, for him as a result of the unwanted rapes. So again, I did an earlier video and talked about um, the paramour rights, what were understood as paramour rights of um, white men, powerful white men over slave women, even during the time of even during the time when anti-miscegenation laws exist, saying which prohibited interracial sex and interracial marriage. but it was understood in the slaveholding states and Jim Crow states that white men had paramount rights over the bodies of black women, even if they uh, if they gave consent or not. So, so Celia, came to realize that the main purpose of Mr. Newsom purchasing her was to use her as a concubine to be having sex with, even though he was 70 years old. She was only 14 years old at the time, because he gave her a separate a place, right? A brick house. He made a solid brick house for her, which was relatively spacious, and it was just about 60 paces from his own place, right? From his own main house, just about 60 paces. And he kept her separate from the other slaves, right? He only had black slaves, right? The only so she was the only female slave that was on the property. So it's interesting that he had two daughters. He had two older daughters, and at some point she tried to appeal to them to get them to stop him from having the to stop their father from forcing himself on her. But it's from the story one realizes that it appears that even white women understood and accepted the paramount rights of white men during the era of slavery. And so the daughters of Mr. Newsom did nothing about it. The older daughters of Mr. Newsom did nothing about it despite her appeals. So at some point, though, when she got older, when she was became around 18 years old, she developed a sexual relationship with one of Mr. Newsom's slaves. His name was George. So George now told. So she became pregnant. So because she was having sex with both Mr. Newsom and the slave George, she was not sure uh, who was the father of the child she was now carrying. So she was pregnant with the third child. So it was around this time that the slave George um, persisted, and he became adamant, told Celia that he would not be in a relationship with her if she did not stop having sexual relations with the boss, with her slave master. That's Mr. Newsom. So she tried to appeal to Mr. Newsom to stop raping her, but he ignored her. So sometime in June, sometime June 23, 1955, even though she was pregnant now with a third child, he said he would come to her place for sex. So she told him not to come, otherwise she would harm him. She expressly told him not to come, otherwise she would harm him. He came anyway, at which point she pummeled him with a stick, and he ended up dying. She beat him up with a stick. He ended up dying. It was an old man. When she discovered he was dead, she tried to cover up the crime by throwing his body into the fireplace within her um, in her accommodation, right? So in her lodgings. So in the morning, his bones were taken out with the embers, and so. Uh, but subsequently, the daughters realized he was missing, and then they called out a search, and then they finally found out what happened. Interrogated Celia. She confessed to killing him, and so she was eventually indicted of murder, and taken to Callaway County Jail. She was taken to Callaway County Jail. She was charged for murder. So the court appointed an expert lawyer on her behalf to defend her in a trial. Of course, there were certain elements, that showed the distinctions, right? Uh, in the protection of with regard to rights of the accused, right? That just didn't apply to a slave person. Um, the Sixth Amendment was there from our founding, right? The Sixth Amendment entitles us to an impartial jury. That was not the case. You didn't have an impartial jury because they were all white people, right? These were all white men. They were either pro-slavery or all slave owners, right? And in addition, let's remember, so this case became sensational because this was the time, it was close towards the time of the Civil War when slavery was very controversial. The Kansas Nebraska Act had been passed, I think, in 1854. So this was the very so America was very divided on the issue of slavery. It was a flashpoint, and so again, back to in terms of her rights, the rights of the accused, her being a slave, she didn't have. There was no impartial jury because they were all white people. They were pro-slavery or slave owners themselves. Something else that happened that denied her rights. Uh, One of the arguments that the her lawyer wanted to use was a law in the prevailing law in Kansas. The prevailing law in Kansas allowed women, right? It said that a woman was able to argue self-defense, even she was able to defend herself to the point of committing homicide if it's done if she's attacked if she's under attack, if she's forced to have sex, right? If she's raped, rape was a defense to homicide. So anything, any attack, assault that tried to force her, compel her, use duress, extort, her sex, right? So rape was a defense against homicide in the state of Missouri. Women could defend themselves successfully against um, uh, rape as a self-defense, for homicide in the state of that was a law in the state of Missouri at the time. However, what her lawyer was now going to test was did this equally apply to black women? Of course, the trial went on, for about 5 days between October 9 and 13, 1955, and the the judge who gave a very biased jury instructions. One, he told the jury that uh, you know homicide, that the actions of Celia could not be argued to be self-defense, right? That the jury were not allowed to do that. That was one. And then regarding his instructions, he all but advised them to convict Celia of first degree murder, which they did. They ended up convicting her of first degree murder, and the sentence was death by hanging. Of course, Celia was pregnant. She managed to escape about 5 days to the day of execution, and she was caught. And but just in time, she would give birth to a stillborn baby, right? And so her baby died. The baby she gave birth to was dead, and eventually she was executed on uh, was it December 21st, 1855, right? December 21st, 1855, right? She was executed. She was hanged. So it is a very sad case, and so you see the differences, in the treatment of women based on race and their socioeconomic status. So the law had a different notion of things. One of the federal judges, because it drew national attention, and you often get to study this case in law school, so many people have commented. One of the federal judges who commented on the case was Leon Higginbotham, and he said, look, that the trial was sham. It was a sham trial, as many people, including her lawyer. She just said, look, this was a sham trial because he was an expert, very skilled lawyer. She was lucky to have him. By the way, during the era of chattel slavery in the state of Missouri, slaves were not allowed to testify in court. Slaves could not testify on in their case in court, which is, of course, contrary to what's in the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment, we're allowed to be witnesses on our behalf. We are also allowed to draw witnesses to, to speak uh, on our behalf. There's a subpoena process to compel witnesses to appear in court and testify on our behalf. We're entitled to cross-examine our accusers as well. Of course, it was the state of Missouri that had a case against Celia, and her master was dead, but she was not able to speak on her behalf. The way we know the story is because when she was captured, when she was indicted, after it was discovered that her master, Mr. Newsom, had been killed, she immediately confessed. They interrogated her, questioned her, and she confessed to the whole thing and confessed to having murdered him, right? She didn't deny what happened. So many things were even violated at that time, right? She didn't have access to a lawyer, the questioning. In modern times, right, if they were to question somebody, an accused person, if they were to arrest, if the law was to arrest an accused person, right, they'd have a lawyer with them. They wouldn't just speak, right? They wouldn't, they had a right to be silent. They could invoke the Fifth Amendment. That's a right to be silent. And then the Sixth Amendment, they have right to have a lawyer to speak on their behalf, so they don't have to say anything. But you see, slaves didn't have, the law didn't treat them in the same way. And you can see that the law didn't allow slaves to testify in court on their behalf, so they couldn't speak. And then we saw that the extant Missouri law at the time, Missouri law at the time, which allowed women to use self-defense, uh, you know, to argue self-defense, uh, um, you know, against, in self-defense in the event of rape, you know, where homicide occurs as a result of, as a defense against rape. This didn't equally apply uh, to slave women during, at that time. Now, the federal judge Leon Higginbottom, what he said was that it showed that a slave woman um, had no virtue, which the law protected against the lust of a master. Of course, the master being the white slave master, right, the white slave owner. And he said the Missouri versus Celia case was a more venal and racist state case than even the more famous Dred Scott case. Venal means very corrupt, right? Very corrupt, utterly corrupt, and contemptible, very corrupt. So uh, I just wanted to, discuss landmark cases. Like, it's a very dismal, dolorous case, and it reflects the dehumanization and the human rights abuses and how the law, did not protect black people during the era of chattel slavery. And I'd done an earlier video in which I discussed um, the case of Ruby Jackson, who became Ruby McCollum, right, in the Florida case, in which she was a victim of a white physician. And even though she was a wealthy, highly respected, stately black woman um, in Florida in Jim Crow, in Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow South, a white physician um, whom she killed because he had been raping her constantly. Um, his name being, Dr. Leon Adams. Uh, it showed how she had no protection. Even after slavery, during the era of Jim Crow, white men, powerful white men especially, were still able to extort um, sex from unwilling black women. It didn't matter what their social status was. So, and we see that in the case uh, of Ruby McCollum, uh, when the physician whom she was alleged to have killed, she was convicted of killing him, but that was overturned. The case was overturned, and she had to spend a substantial amount of time in a in the Florida State Mental Hospital, since she was deemed incompetent to stand trial. She ultimately got her freedom, but her life, she had had a charmed life. She had been amongst the few prosperous, wealthy black women in the Jim Crow South. But the era, the laws were so against black people during the time, and they could be easily exploited, and they could lose everything, lose their freedom, lose their dignity. And we see this, that in the era of chattel slavery, in the case of Missouri versus Celia the slave of 1855, uh, you know, black women were property who just existed for the benefit of white men. And it is so sad that so one of the witnesses against it is ironic that one of the witnesses against Celia the slave was a black man she was in love with, George. Um, I don't know if he testified in court, but he was one of the main people who actually revealed that he saw the last time that he saw, uh, Mr. Newsom, their slave master, was when he went into the quarters of Celia, and that was why they focused on her. And throughout, the interrogators, the state, the law enforcement had tried to get her uh, to rope in other people, especially George, to say, well, that she actually planned it with George. But throughout, she refused. She took sole responsibility. She never implicated George. It's unfortunate that George sold her out very easily. So these are some of the challenges that the black community faced during the era of slavery, and again, they continue to face, um, even after slavery and Jim Crow. So I study these cases, as a professional. I graduated from law school. So new Nigerians, new African Americans, I hope, they're able to use the opportunity as well to study the community, the black community in America, and for them to be able to understand the complexities in America, right? It's not, it's not black or white, right? There's a whole broad spectrum of, of gray area, right? And other colors. This video has gotten long, and I will keep you posted. My name is Osha. Thank you for watching. Bye.